England, winter of 1402. Snow fell softly over the rolling hills of Northumberland as the last light of day bled crimson across the horizon, staining the ancient stones of Ravensworth Castle in hues of blood and gold. The wind carried whispers of frost through the bare branches of the oaks that lined the eastern wall, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour of vespers, its mournful song fading into the gathering darkness. Within the castle stables, where the warmth of horses and hay held the cold at bay, a young woman moved with practiced grace between the wooden stalls. Her name was Amara, and at 22 years of age, she had spent the better part of her life within these walls. First as the daughter of a Moorish merchant who had traveled from the kingdoms of West Africa to trade in spices and silk, and later, after her father's death from fever when she was but 12, as a servant in the household of the Duke of Ravensworth. Her skin was the color of burnished ebony, smooth and luminous even in the dim light of the oil lamps that hung from the stable beams. Her eyes were dark as midnight pools, framed by lashes that cast shadows upon her high cheekbones, and her hair, which she kept hidden beneath a simple linen coif, fell in tight coils that held secrets of distant lands and ancient lineages. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to another world entirely, a beauty that the servants whispered about, and the nobility pretended not to notice. But Amara had long ago learned that beauty was both blessing and curse for a woman of her position. It drew eyes that she did not wish to meet, attention that she could not afford to court. And so she had cultivated invisibility like a second skin, moving through the castle like a shadow, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her gaze lowered, and her thoughts locked away behind a mask of quiet servitude. She ran her hand along the neck of the gray stallion she had been grooming, feeling the warmth of his flesh beneath her palm, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Tempest, they called him, for his spirit was wild and untamed, and he had thrown every rider who had attempted to master him, every rider except Amara. She alone could gentle him with a word, could coax him to stillness with nothing more than the pressure of her hand and the soft melody of a song her mother had taught her before the fever had claimed her too. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention toward the stable entrance. Through the gap between the wooden doors, she could see a figure silhouetted against the fading light, and even before the doors swung open, she knew who it was. She would have recognized that stride anywhere, the arrogant swagger of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Lord Edmund Blackwood, the young Duke of Ravensworth, stepped into the stable, and the very air seemed to shift around him. He was 26 years old, tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of training in arms, and a face that might have been carved from marble by a sculptor who wished to capture both beauty and cruelty in a single countenance. His hair was the color of a raven's wing, falling in careless waves to his collar, and his eyes were pale gray, the color of winter ice, sharp and assessing and utterly without warmth. He wore a doublet of deep burgundy velvet, embroidered with silver thread that caught the lamplight and glittered like stars, and a cloak of black wool lined with fur hung from his shoulders. A signet ring bearing the Blackwood crest, a raven clutching a rose in its talons, gleamed on his right hand. Everything about him spoke of wealth, of power, of a lineage that stretched back to the Norman conquest and beyond. Amara lowered her gaze as he approached, her hand stilling on the stallion's neck. She could feel his eyes upon her, could sense the weight of his attention like a physical pressure against her skin. "So, this is where you hide yourself," he said, and his voice was low and smooth, carrying the lazy drawl of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. "I have been searching for you, stable girl." She did not look up. "I was not aware that your grace required my presence, my lord." "Your grace requires many things." He stopped a few feet from where she stood, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath and the musk of expensive perfume that clung to his clothing. "Most of which are none of your concern. But today, I have a task for you, a most particular task." Amara's heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. In the 3 years since Edmund Blackwood had inherited his father's title and estates, she had learned to dread the sound of those words. His tasks were never simple, never innocent. They were tests, games, ways of reminding those beneath him of their place in the order of things. "I am at your grace's service," she said, because there was nothing else she could say. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. Indeed you are. Indeed you are. He began to pace, his boots leaving prints in the hay-strewn floor. Tell me, stable girl, have you heard of the Winter's Eve ball? Amara's hands tightened on the brush she still held. The Winter's Eve ball was the most prestigious social event in all of Northumberland, a gathering of nobles from across the kingdom that the Dukes of Ravensworth had hosted for 300 years. It was spoken of in whispers among the servants, a glittering dream of music and dancing and candlelight that existed in a world entirely separate from their own. I have heard of it, my lord, she said carefully. Then you know that it is to be held 3 days hence, here at Ravensworth Castle. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that made her blood run cold. And you know that every noble family in the north will be in attendance. The Earl of Northampton, the Marquess of Westbury, even the Duke of Lancaster himself, cousin to the king. Yes, my lord. Good. He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. Then you will understand the significance of what I am about to propose. You see, I have grown weary of these tedious gatherings, these endless parades of simpering ladies and pompous lords who think themselves my equals. I have grown weary of their pretensions, their hypocrisies, their insufferable self-regard. He stepped closer, and Amara forced herself to remain still, to not retreat, to not show the fear that coiled in her stomach like a serpent. And so I have decided to give them a gift, a reminder of their own absurdity. His eyes glittered with malicious amusement. I am going to invite a stable girl to the Winter's Eve ball. I am going to dress her in silk and jewels and present her as a visiting princess from a distant land. And then, when the night is at its height, when every lord and lady in attendance has paid her homage, I am going to reveal the truth. I am going to show them all what fools they are, how easily they can be deceived by nothing more than a pretty gown and a few well-chosen words. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. She understood everything. And I have chosen you, he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. You, with your exotic beauty and your foreign features. You, who can speak 3 languages and read Latin because your merchant father had pretensions above his station. You are perfect for my purposes, stable girl. Absolutely perfect. She should have refused. She should have fallen to her knees and begged him to choose someone else, anyone else. But Amara had learned long ago that refusal was not an option for people like her. The Duke of Ravensworth could do with her as he pleased, and there was no power in heaven or earth that could stop him. And yet, somewhere deep within her chest, beneath the fear and the anger and the humiliation, something else stirred. Something that felt almost like defiance. And if I do this thing, my lord? She asked, and her voice was steady, though she did not know how. What then? He waved a dismissive hand. Then you return to your horses and your hay, and we never speak of it again. Consider it an adventure, stable girl. A night when you will wear silk instead of homespun, when you will taste wine instead of water, when you will see how the other half lives. His smile widened. Who knows? You might even enjoy yourself. Before the fall, that is. Amara looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met and held, and in that moment something passed between them, something that neither of them could name or understand. A challenge, perhaps, or a recognition of kindred spirits, 2 souls shaped by circumstances beyond their control into weapons of survival. Very well, my lord, she said at last. I will do as you command. Excellent. He turned away, already dismissing her from his thoughts. Report to the castle seamstress tomorrow at dawn. She will see to your transformation. And stable girl? He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. Do try not to disappoint me. I have such high hopes for this particular entertainment. And then he was gone, swallowed by the gathering darkness, leaving Amara alone with the horses and the silence and the terrible knowledge of what was to come. She stood motionless for a long moment, her hand pressed against Tempest's warm flank, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. And then, slowly, she raised her head and looked toward the castle, where candlelight flickered in 100 windows and the sounds of preparation for the coming festivities drifted across the snow-covered courtyard. She thought of her father, who had crossed oceans and deserts to build a new life in this strange, cold land. She thought of her mother, who had died with Amara's name on her lips and love in her eyes. She thought of all the indignities she had suffered, all the cruelties she had endured, all the dreams she had buried so deep that she had almost forgotten they existed. And something shifted within her. Something hardened, crystallized, became as bright and sharp as a blade of pure light. The Duke of Ravensworth thought he was using her as a pawn in his game. He thought she would crumble, would humiliate herself, would provide him with the entertainment he craved. He was wrong. Amara did not yet know how, did not yet know what she would do or what she would become. But she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like the cold of winter itself, that she would not be broken. Not by him, not by anyone. She would attend his ball, she would play his game, but the ending would be hers to write. The snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, covering the world in white. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of courage, dignity, and love that transcends all barriers move your heart, then you belong here with us. Subscribe now, so you never miss a tale that will stay with you long after the last word fades. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ravensworth Castle, the pale light filtering through clouds that hung low over the land like a burial shroud. Amara had not slept. She had lain awake through the long hours of the night, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the servants' quarters, her mind turning over and over the events of the previous evening like a hand worrying a wound. Now, as she made her way through the castle corridors toward the seamstress's chamber, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against her eyelids, the ache of tension in her shoulders and neck. But beneath the weariness, something else burned, something fierce and bright that she had not felt in years. The seamstress's chamber was located in the eastern tower, a large room filled with bolts of fabric and half-finished garments and the sharp smell of dye and wool. Amara had never been inside before. Servants of her station had no reason to visit such places. The gowns that hung from hooks along the walls were meant for noble ladies, for women who had never worked a day in their lives, whose hands were soft and white and unmarked by labor. A woman stood with her back to the door, her gray hair pulled into a tight knot at the nape of her neck, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency over a length of deep blue silk. She did not turn as Amara entered, but her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly gentle. "Close the door behind you, child, and come into the light where I can see you." Amara did as she was told, stepping into the pool of pale morning light that fell through the tower window. The seamstress turned then, and Amara saw that she was old, older than she had first appeared, with a face like crumpled parchment, and eyes that were startlingly clear and blue, like chips of summer sky set into weathered stone. "So," the seamstress said, studying her with an intensity that made Amara want to look away, "you are the one." "I am the one the Duke has chosen," Amara replied carefully, "for his entertainment." The old woman made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sigh. "I know what he has chosen you for, girl. I have served 3 generations of Blackwoods, and I have seen many such entertainments come and go." She shook her head slowly. "But I have never seen one quite like this." She moved closer, and her gnarled fingers reached out to touch Amara's face, turning it this way and that in the light. Amara held herself still, submitting to the examination, though every instinct screamed at her to pull away. "Beautiful," the seamstress murmured almost to herself. "Truly beautiful. Your father was from the kingdoms of Africa, was he not? I remember when he first came to these shores, with his strange goods and stranger manners. He was a proud man, a good man." Amara's throat tightened. "You knew my father?" "I knew him." The seamstress released her face and stepped back, her expression unreadable. "I made the gown your mother wore on their wedding day. Cream silk, embroidered with golden thread. She looked like a queen." For a moment, Amara could not speak. The memory of her mother rose before her, unbidden and painful. The soft curve of her smile, the warmth of her embrace, the sound of her voice singing lullabies in a language Amara could barely remember. "What is your name?" she asked at last, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I am called Martha," the seamstress replied, "and I am perhaps the only person in this castle who does not wish to see you fall." She turned away, moving toward a large wooden chest that sat beneath the window. "The Duke has commanded that you be dressed as a princess. Very well, I shall dress you as a princess, but not the princess he imagines." She opened the chest and began to pull out lengths of fabric, each more beautiful than the last. Silk the color of midnight, embroidered with stars of silver thread. Velvet as deep and rich as aged wine. Cloth of gold that caught the morning light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. "These belong to the late Duchess," Martha said, her voice soft with memory. "The Duke's mother. She was a woman of rare grace and beauty, and she had a kind heart. It broke when she realized what manner of son she had raised." She paused, her hands stilling on the fabric. "She died 5 years past, and her gowns have lain here ever since, waiting for someone worthy to wear them." Amara stared at the treasures before her, her heart pounding. "I cannot wear the Duchess's gowns. If the Duke were to discover—" "The Duke does not know what gowns his mother possessed," Martha interrupted. "He never paid attention to such things. He knows only that I am to dress you magnificently, and magnificently you shall be dressed." Her eyes met Amara's, and in their depths, Amara saw something that looked almost like hope. "But more than that, child, I shall teach you." "Teach me? How to walk, how to speak, how to hold yourself as though you were born to command." Martha's voice grew fierce. "The Duke thinks he is setting a trap. He thinks you will stumble and fall and provide him with sport. But what if you do not fall? What if you rise?" Amara felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Why would you help me? Why would you risk the Duke's anger?" Martha was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, seeing something that Amara could not see. "Because I am old," she said at last, "and I have served wickedness for too many years. Because your mother was kind to me when kindness was rare, and your father treated me with respect when others did not. And because—" She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Because I have watched that boy become a monster, and I am tired of watching the innocent suffer for his amusement." She reached out and took Amara's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have 3 days, child. 3 days to learn what noble ladies spend lifetimes perfecting. It will not be easy. It may not even be possible. But if you are willing to try, I am willing to teach." Amara looked down at their joined hands, the old woman's pale and wrinkled, her own dark and smooth. 2 women, separated by age and station and the color of their skin, united by something deeper than any of those things. "I am willing," she said. And Martha smiled, the first true smile Amara had seen on her weathered face. "Then, let us begin." The hours that followed were among the most exhausting of Amara's life. Martha was a demanding teacher, brooking no excuse and accepting no failure. She drilled Amara in the art of walking, teaching her to glide rather than stride, to move as though she were floating on air rather than treading upon solid ground. She corrected her posture 100 times, adjusting the angle of her chin, the set of her shoulders, the position of her hands. "A princess does not slouch," she said again and again. "A princess does not hurry. A princess moves as though she has all the time in the world, because the world will wait for her." She taught Amara the proper forms of address, the intricate hierarchy of nobility that governed who spoke first and who listened, who sat and who stood, who entered a room and who waited to be admitted. She taught her the art of conversation, the delicate dance of words that revealed nothing and implied everything. "You must never say what you mean directly," Martha explained. "That is the way of commoners. Nobility speaks in riddles, in implications, in carefully chosen silences. What you do not say is often more important than what you do. By midday, Amara's feet ached from walking in the delicate slippers Martha had produced. Her back screamed from holding the unfamiliar posture, and her mind spun with the countless rules and expectations that had been poured into it. But she did not complain. She did not falter. She absorbed everything Martha taught her with a fierce concentration that surprised even herself. Because with every passing hour, the goal became clearer. The Duke thought she was a tool to be used and discarded. But Amara was beginning to see that she could be something more. She could be a weapon. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to fade and the candles were lit against the gathering darkness, Martha finally allowed her to rest. Amara sank into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion, and accepted the cup of warm cider that the old seamstress pressed into her hands. "You learn quickly," Martha said, settling into a chair across from her. "Faster than I expected. Your father taught you well." "My father taught me that knowledge is the only true power," Amara replied. "That a mind well trained is worth more than a sword well forged. He used to say that our people built kingdoms and libraries while the Europeans were still painting themselves blue and living in caves." Martha chuckled. He was not wrong. Though I would not recommend repeating that sentiment to the Duke of Lancaster. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the shadows dancing on the walls. And then Martha spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "There is something else I must tell you, something the Duke does not know because he has never cared enough to learn." Amara looked up, her attention sharpening. The Duke of Lancaster, who will attend the ball, is a man of curious tastes. He has traveled widely to the Holy Land and beyond, and he has a deep interest in the kingdoms of Africa and the East. He has met with kings and scholars from those lands, and he speaks their languages, and he holds them in high regard. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with significance. "If you can engage him in conversation, if you can speak to him of your father's homeland and your mother's people, he will not see a stable girl in a borrowed gown. He will see a princess. And the Duke of Ravensworth will find his game turned against him." Amara felt a spark of something ignite in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of a plan. "Tell me more," she said. And Martha did. 2 days had passed since Amara's first lesson with Martha, and she had spent every waking hour in the seamstress's tower, learning, practicing, transforming. The servants whispered about her absence from the stables, but the Duke had given orders that she was not to be disturbed, and no one dared question his commands. On the morning of the 3rd day, the day of the Winter's Eve ball, Martha unveiled the gown. Amara stood before the looking-glass, unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to believe that the woman who stared back at her was truly herself. The gown was a masterpiece. It was made of silk the color of the midnight sky, so deep a blue that it appeared almost black in shadow and blazed with sapphire brilliance in the light. Embroidered across the bodice and skirt were hundreds of tiny stars, wrought in silver thread so fine that they seemed to shimmer and dance with every movement. The neckline was cut low but modest, revealing the graceful column of her throat and the curve of her collarbone, and the sleeves were long and fitted, ending in points that covered the backs of her hands. Around her waist, Martha had fastened a belt of silver links, from which hung a small purse embroidered with the image of a raven, and around her throat she had placed a necklace of midnight pearls that gleamed with iridescent fire. Her hair had been released from its coif and arranged in an elaborate style, woven with silver ribbons and tiny crystal beads that caught the light like drops of morning dew. She looked like a queen. She looked like a goddess. She looked like nothing the Duke of Ravensworth had ever imagined. "The late Duchess wore this gown on the night she met the King of England," Martha said softly, standing behind her. "She said it made her feel as though she carried the night sky upon her shoulders, as though she were clothed in the very heavens." Amara reached out and touched the glass, her fingers trembling. "I do not know if I can do this." "You can." Martha's voice was firm. "You have learned everything I could teach you. The rest is within you. It has always been within you." She turned Amara to face her, her gnarled hands gripping her shoulders with surprising strength. "Listen to me, child. Tonight you will walk into that ballroom and every eye will turn toward you. There will be those who seek to belittle you, to expose you, to watch you fall. The Duke chief among them. But there will be others who will see you for what you truly are. A woman of intelligence, of grace, of dignity. Those are the ones who matter. Those are the ones who will remember this night long after the Duke's petty games are forgotten. She pressed something into Amara's hand. A small vial of perfume, the scent of jasmine and sandalwood and something else, something deeper and more mysterious. "This was your mother's," Martha said. "She gave it to me before she died and asked me to keep it until the time was right. I believe the time is now." Amara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She could not afford to weep, not now. Not when she needed every ounce of strength she possessed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Martha smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young again. "Thank me when the night is over. Thank me when you have shown them all who you truly are." The great hall of Ravensworth Castle had been transformed. 1,000 candles blazed from chandeliers of wrought iron and crystal, casting golden light across walls hung with tapestries of silk and gold. Fresh rushes, scented with lavender and rosemary, covered the stone floor, and great fires roared in the twin hearths at either end of the hall, driving back the winter cold. Musicians played from a gallery above the main floor, their melodies weaving through the air like threads of silver, and servants in the Blackwood livery moved through the crowd, bearing trays of wine and delicacies. The cream of English nobility had gathered beneath that vaulted ceiling. Earls and countesses, barons and baronesses, knights and ladies, all arrayed in their finest garments, their jewels glittering, their faces painted with the elaborate masks of aristocratic composure. They spoke in low voices, exchanging gossip and intrigue, watching one another with the careful attention of predators assessing potential prey. And at the center of it all, resplendent in a doublet of black velvet embroidered with silver ravens, stood the Duke of Ravensworth. His pale eyes swept the crowd with barely concealed boredom, and his lips were curved in a smile that held no warmth. He was waiting, Amara knew, waiting for his entertainment to begin. She stood in the shadows of the entrance hall, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands cold despite the warmth of the fires. Through the archway, she could see the glittering assembly, could hear the murmur of voices and the strains of music. In a moment, she would step through that arch. In a moment, her fate would be decided. "Announcing," the herald called, his voice ringing through the great hall, "Her Royal Highness, Princess Amara of the Kingdom of Mali, daughter of the great merchant Lord Kofi Beaumont, ambassador to the courts of Europe." Silence fell like a blade. Amara stepped into the light. Every head turned, every eye fixed upon her. She could feel the weight of 100 gazes, the press of 100 judgments, the hush of 100 held breaths, and for one terrible moment she faltered. For one terrible moment, she was nothing but a stable girl in a borrowed gown, a pretender, a fraud. And then she remembered Martha's words. She remembered her father's teachings. She remembered her mother's love. And something within her shifted, straightened, blazed into life. She raised her chin. She squared her shoulders. She allowed a small, serene smile to curve her lips. And she walked. She did not stride or hurry. She glided, as Martha had taught her, as though she were floating on a sea of stars. Her gown whispered against the rushes, her pearls gleamed in the candlelight, and the perfume of jasmine and sandalwood trailed behind her like a memory of distant shores. She moved through the crowd as though she belonged there, as though she had always belonged there, and the nobles parted before her like waves before the prow of a ship. She saw surprise in some faces, suspicion in others, but in many she saw something else entirely: admiration. She made her way toward the Duke, who stood frozen near the great hearth, his expression a mask of barely controlled astonishment. She had expected mockery, had expected triumph. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like uncertainty. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was clear and steady. carrying the musical cadence that Martha had taught her. "I thank you for the honor of this invitation. Your hospitality is spoken of even in the distant courts of my homeland." For a moment, he could only stare. Then he recovered, his features smoothing into their customary arrogance. "Princess Amara, you are most welcome." But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she could not quite read. Confusion, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his game was not proceeding as planned. Before he could say more, another voice cut through the crowd. "Did I hear correctly? A princess of Mali?" Amara turned to find herself face to face with a man in his middle years, his beard streaked with gray and his eyes alight with genuine interest. He wore the livery of the House of Lancaster, and the gold chain around his neck marked him as a man of the highest rank. "Your Royal Highness," she said, sinking into the deep curtsy that Martha had drilled into her until she could perform it in her sleep. "I am honored beyond words." The Duke of Lancaster reached out and raised her to her feet, his manner warm and unaffected. "None of that, my lady. I have long wished to meet someone of your heritage. I traveled to Timbuktu in my youth, and I have never forgotten the magnificence of that great city, the learning of its scholars, the grace of its people." His smile was genuine. "Tell me, is it true that your father was a merchant of the gold routes? If this story of courage and transformation is touching your heart, leave a comment now with the words, 'Dignity cannot be borrowed. It is born within.' Let me know if you feel the power of Amara's journey, and I will know that this story has found its rightful audience." The hours that followed were unlike anything Amara had ever experienced. The Duke of Lancaster proved to be everything Martha had promised, a man of genuine curiosity and broad learning, who listened to her stories of her father's homeland with rapt attention and asked questions that revealed a deep respect for cultures beyond his own. He introduced her to his wife, a gracious woman with kind eyes, and to several other nobles who shared his interest in the wider world. And through it all, Amara spoke. She spoke of the great kingdoms of Africa, of Ghana and Mali and Songhai, of cities built of gold and libraries filled with manuscripts from across the known world. She spoke of her father's journeys, of the spices and silks he had traded, of the wisdom he had gathered from scholars and sages of a dozen lands. She spoke with the eloquence her father had taught her, and the grace Martha had instilled, and she watched as prejudice and suspicion gave way, in face after face, to admiration and respect. She was not playing a role. She was not pretending to be something she was not. She was simply being herself, the self she had hidden for so long, the self the world had told her had no place among the noble and the powerful. And that self, it turned out, was more than enough. The Duke of Ravensworth watched from across the hall, and his expression grew darker with each passing hour. His game was unraveling before his eyes. The stable girl he had meant to humiliate was becoming the sensation of the evening, the woman everyone wished to speak with, the mysterious princess who had captivated the most powerful men in the kingdom. And then the music changed. The musicians struck up a galliard, one of the most demanding dances of the age, a display of skill and grace that only the most accomplished dancers dared attempt. Amara felt her heart quicken. Martha had taught her the steps, had drilled her until she could perform them flawlessly, but she had never danced before such an audience, had never tested her skills against the finest dancers in England. "Princess Amara." The Duke of Lancaster extended his hand, his eyes twinkling. "Would you do me the honor?" She hesitated for only a moment. Then she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her to the center of the floor. The crowd parted to give them room. Amara was aware of every eye upon her, of the weight of expectation and judgment, of the Duke of Ravensworth watching from the shadows with an expression of barely concealed fury. But she pushed all of it aside. She focused on the music, on the rhythm, on the steps that Martha had burned into her memory, and she danced. She danced as though she had been born to it, as though the blood of queens flowed in her veins. She matched the Duke of Lancaster step for step, her movements fluid and precise, her gown swirling around her like a midnight tempest shot through with stars. The music swelled, and she soared with it. forgetting for a moment that she was a servant, forgetting the cruelty that had brought her here, knowing only the pure, fierce joy of the dance. When the music ended, the hall erupted in applause. The Duke of Lancaster bowed low over her hand, his face flushed with exertion and delight. "My lady," he said, "you have made an old man feel young again. I have not danced so well in 20 years. Before Amara could respond, another voice cut through the applause. Cold, sharp, venomous. How touching. The crowd fell silent as the Duke of Ravensworth strode into the center of the floor, his pale eyes blazing with barely controlled rage. He stopped a few feet from Amara, his lips twisted into a sneer that transformed his handsome face into something ugly and cruel. "Tell me, Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Does the Kingdom of Mali know that their princess spends her days shoveling horse manure in an English stable?" A gasp rippled through the crowd. Amara felt the blood drain from her face, felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. This was the moment she had dreaded. This was the trap snapping shut. "What?" The Duke of Lancaster's voice was sharp with confusion. "What is the meaning of this, Ravensworth?" "The meaning, Your Royal Highness, is that you have been deceived." The Duke of Ravensworth's smile was triumphant, vicious. "This woman is no princess. She is a stable girl, a servant in my own household. I dressed her up as a jest, a bit of entertainment to enliven this tedious evening, and you, all of you, fell for it completely." The silence that followed was absolute. Amara could feel the eyes of the crowd upon her, could see the expressions shifting from admiration to confusion to contempt. Everything she had built over the course of the evening was crumbling, collapsing, falling to ruin around her. And in that moment, something within her broke. Not her spirit, not her will, but the chains that had bound her for so long, the fear and the shame and the belief that she was less than those who looked down upon her. She stepped forward. "It is true," she said, and her voice rang clear and strong through the silent hall. "I am not a princess. I am the daughter of Kofi Beaumont, a merchant who traveled from the great city of Timbuktu to trade in the markets of England. And yes, I have spent the past 10 years working in the stables of Ravensworth Castle, caring for horses and sleeping in servants' quarters, and enduring the contempt of those who believe that the color of my skin determines the worth of my soul." She turned to face the Duke of Ravensworth, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. "The Duke thought to humiliate me tonight. He thought to dress me in silk and parade me before you, and then tear away the mask and reveal me as a fraud. He thought I would crumble, would weep, would provide him with sport." Her voice grew stronger, fiercer. "But I am no fraud. Everything I have spoken tonight is true. My father was a merchant of the gold roots. My ancestors built kingdoms and libraries while Europe slumbered in darkness. The knowledge I carry, the languages I speak, the dignity I hold, these are not borrowed things. They are my birthright." She swept her gaze across the assembled nobles, meeting their eyes one by one. "You may look down upon me for my station. You may despise me for the color of my skin. But you cannot take from me what I truly am. And what I am, my lords and ladies, is the daughter of kings. Not because of any title or crown, but because I carry within me the legacy of a people who built wonders that your ancestors could scarcely imagine." Silence stretched through the great hall, and then, slowly, the Duke of Lancaster began to applaud. "Well spoken," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "Well spoken indeed." He turned to the Duke of Ravensworth, and his expression was cold. "I have traveled far, Ravensworth, and I have met many kinds of men. Kings who were fools and fools who were kings. Nobles who were base and commoners who were noble. And I have learned that true worth is not determined by birth or station, but by the quality of one's character." He extended his hand to Amara. "My lady, whatever your title, you have conducted yourself with more grace and dignity tonight than half the nobles in this hall. I would be honored to continue our conversation." The night did not end with Amara's speech. It transformed. The Duke of Lancaster's public endorsement shifted the mood of the entire assembly. Other nobles, taking their cue from the most powerful man in the room, began to approach Amara with renewed interest. Some were curious, some were cautious, but many seemed genuinely moved by her words and impressed by her bearing. The Duke of Ravensworth retreated to the shadows, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. His jest had backfired spectacularly. Instead of providing entertainment at Amara's expense, he had inadvertently elevated her to the status of a cause célèbre, a symbol of dignity in the face of cruelty. But Amara knew that the night was not over. She knew that the Duke's humiliation would demand a response, that men like him did not suffer defeat gracefully, and so she remained alert, even as she conversed with duchesses and danced with earls, watching always for the danger she knew was coming. It came in the small hours of the morning, when the candles had burned low and the crowd had thinned to a few dozen guests. Amara had stepped onto the balcony overlooking the snow-covered gardens, seeking a moment of solitude when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find the Duke of Ravensworth standing in the doorway, his pale eyes glittering with something that was not quite anger, not quite desperation, but some volatile mixture of both. "You think you have won," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think that because Lancaster and his ilk have taken your side, you are safe. But you forget, stable girl. This is my castle, these are my lands, and when the guests have departed and the candles have guttered out, you will still be what you have always been. A servant. My servant." Amara met his gaze without flinching. "I have never forgotten what I am, Your Grace. I have simply stopped being ashamed of it." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at her composure, or the first crack in the armor of his certainty. "You are remarkable," he said, and for a moment his voice held something other than malice. "I have never met anyone like you. When I chose you for this game, I thought I knew what you were. I thought you would be easy to break." "You thought wrong." "Yes." He stepped closer, and the moonlight caught his features, softening them, revealing for just an instant the boy he might once have been, before cruelty and boredom had twisted him into what he had become. "I thought wrong." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, almost uncertain. "My mother used to tell me stories when I was young. Stories of knights who rescued maidens, of kings who ruled with justice, of love that conquered all. I believed those stories once. I believed that the world was good, that people were kind, that I could be something more than what my father was." He turned away, his hands gripping the balcony railing. "But I learned that the world is cruel, that kindness is weakness, that power is the only thing that matters. And so I became what the world expected me to be." Amara said nothing. She waited. "You should hate me," he continued, "for what I have done to you, for what I tried to do tonight. You should want me destroyed." "Hate requires energy," she replied quietly. "I have none to spare for you." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No, I don't suppose you do." He turned back to face her, and his expression was unreadable. "Go, return to your stables. I will not trouble you again." But Amara did not move. "Is that truly what you want? To send me away and pretend this night never happened? To go back to your games and your cruelties and your endless empty boredom? What else is there?" The question hung in the air between them, and Amara felt something stir within her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that might, in time, become understanding. "There is always something else," she said. "There is always a choice. You can continue down the path you have chosen, and you will end as your father ended, feared and hated and alone. Or you can choose differently. You can choose to be the man your mother hoped you would become." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the battle playing out behind his eyes. Pride against conscience. Bitterness against hope. The man he had become against the man he might yet be. "Why do you care?" he asked at last. "After everything I have done, why do you care what becomes of me?" Amara considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. Because you are not the only one who has been twisted by this world, she said. Because I know what it is to be afraid, to be alone, to believe that cruelty is the only language that anyone understands. And because I have learned through great pain and long years that it is possible to choose differently. If I can learn that lesson, then perhaps you can too. The clock in the tower struck 4, its mournful chime echoing across the snow-covered gardens. The ball was ending. The guests would soon depart, and the morning would come, and with it, the return of ordinary life. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the space between them, fragile and uncertain, but real. I do not know if I can be what you describe, the Duke said at last. I do not know if there is enough left of that boy to rebuild. Then discover it, Amara replied. Make the choice and discover it. That is all any of us can do. She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. Amara. It was the first time he had used her name. Not stable girl, not servant. Her name. Yes? The things you spoke of tonight, the kingdoms and libraries of your ancestors, will you tell me more? Not as entertainment, not as a jest, but because I wish to understand. She looked back at him, at the Duke of Ravensworth, who had tried to destroy her and had instead been undone by his own machinations. And she saw for the first time not an enemy, but a man standing at a crossroads. Yes, she said, I will tell you more. 6 months had passed since the Winter's Eve ball, and the world had transformed. Spring had come to Northumberland, painting the hills in shades of green and gold, coaxing flowers from the cold earth and birdsong from the awakening trees. The snow that had blanketed Ravensworth Castle was a distant memory now, replaced by sunshine and warmth and the sweet scent of blossoms drifting on the breeze. And within the castle itself, a different kind of transformation had taken place. Amara stood in the library, a room she had never been permitted to enter during her years as a stable girl, and ran her fingers along the spines of the books that lined the walls. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, containing the accumulated knowledge of centuries. And now, they were hers to read, hers to study, hers to treasure. Much had changed since that fateful night. The Duke of Lancaster, true to his word, had taken a keen interest in Amara's welfare, arranging for her to receive a formal education under the tutelage of scholars from Oxford. He had also spoken to the king himself about her case, and a royal decree had been issued granting her the status of a free woman, no longer bound to any master, free to make her own way in the world. But the most surprising change had come from the Duke of Ravensworth himself. In the months following the ball, Edmund Blackwood had begun to transform. Slowly at first, imperceptibly, like the first green shoots pushing through winter soil. He had dismissed his most sycophantic courtiers and surrounded himself instead with men and women of substance and learning. He had begun to visit the villages on his estates, to speak with the peasants who worked his lands, to learn their names and hear their concerns. He had even, on several occasions, mucked out stalls in the stables, working alongside the servants he had once despised. The nobles of the region whispered about his strange behavior, some attributing it to madness, others to a guilty conscience, still others to the influence of the mysterious African woman who now lived openly in the castle as an honored guest. But Amara knew the truth. She had seen the light kindle in his eyes when he read the books she recommended, had heard the wonder in his voice when she told him stories of distant lands and ancient civilizations. She had watched him choose, day by day, to become something other than what his father had been. It had not been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when old habits reasserted themselves and cruelty flashed in his eyes. There had been arguments, fierce and bitter, when Amara challenged him on his treatment of servants or his assumptions about the natural order of things. But through it all, he had persisted. He had kept choosing, kept striving, kept reaching toward the better self that had lain dormant within him for so long. And in the process, something unexpected had happened. Amara had fallen in love. She had not intended to, she had not wanted to. For months she had held herself apart, had maintained the careful distance that a lifetime of servitude had taught her was necessary for survival. But love, she had learned, did not obey the rules of station or propriety. Love came when it chose, to whom it chose, and demanded only that it be acknowledged. She loved him, not the Duke of Ravensworth, with his wealth and his titles and his ancient lineage, but Edmund, the man who read philosophy by candlelight and asked questions that had no easy answers. Edmund, who had begun to visit the orphanages in the nearby towns and sponsor the education of promising children regardless of their birth. Edmund, who looked at her not as a curiosity or a conquest, but as an equal, a partner, a friend. And she knew, though neither of them had spoken of it directly, that he loved her too. The door to the library opened, and she turned to find him standing there, silhouetted against the afternoon light. He wore simple clothes today, a plain doublet and leather boots, his hair slightly disheveled from his morning ride. He looked nothing like the arrogant aristocrat who had summoned her to the stables 6 months ago. He looked like a man who had finally found his way home. "You are here early?" he said, crossing the room to stand beside her. "I thought you would still be with your tutors." "They released me early. Master Geoffrey said my Latin is now better than his." He laughed, a warm sound that still surprised her sometimes, so different from the cold, mirthless laugh she remembered from that first night. "I do not doubt it. You absorb knowledge like the earth absorbs rain." She smiled but said nothing. There was something in his expression, a gravity beneath the lightness that told her this was not an ordinary visit. "I received a letter this morning," he said, "from the Duke of Lancaster." Her heart quickened. Lancaster's letters usually brought news of significance. "What does it say?" "He wishes to offer you a position at court, as a lady-in-waiting to the Duchess." He paused, and she saw the effort it cost him to keep his voice steady. "It is a great honor. It would give you access to the highest circles of society, opportunities beyond anything you could find here. It is everything you deserve." Amara was silent for a long moment, processing his words. A position at court, access to power and influence, the chance to continue the transformation she had begun on the night of the Winter's Eve ball. It was everything she should want, everything she had dreamed of during the long years of servitude. And yet, "Do you want me to go?" she asked quietly. He turned away, moving to the window, his back to her. "What I want is irrelevant. This is your decision, your future. I have no right to influence it." "That is not what I asked." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion he could no longer conceal. No, I do not want you to go. I want you to stay here with me. I want to continue reading with you and arguing with you and learning from you. I want to wake every morning knowing that I will see your face, hear your voice, feel the light that you have brought into this cold, dark castle." He turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Amara. I love you as I have never loved anyone in my life. And I know that I have no right to ask anything of you after everything I have done. I know that the honorable thing would be to send you away, to give you the future you deserve. But I cannot. I cannot pretend that my heart does not break at the thought of losing you." Amara crossed the room to stand before him. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm, the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. "You foolish man," she said softly. "Did you think I would leave?" His eyes searched hers, desperate and hopeful in equal measure. "But Lancaster offers me a position at court. You offer me your heart." She smiled, and it was a smile that held all the warmth and tenderness she had kept hidden for so long. "I know which I value more." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, feeling the strength of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against her own. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love over pride and understanding over prejudice. "Marry me," he whispered against her hair. "Not as a duke marrying a servant. not as a game or a jest or a scandal, but as a man who loves a woman, wholly and completely and without reservation. Marry me, Amara." She pulled back just far enough to look into his eyes. "Your peers will be scandalized. Your family will be horrified. The church may refuse to perform the ceremony. Let them be scandalized. Let them be horrified. Let them refuse." His voice was fierce, certain. "I will find a priest who sees the truth, that before God we are all equal. I will stand before the world and declare my love for you. And if the world objects, then the world can go hang." Amara laughed, a sound of pure joy that she had not known she was capable of making. "Very well then, Edmund Blackwood, Duke of Ravensworth. I will marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and passionate and full of promise, and she kissed him back, and the spring sunshine poured through the library windows, and somewhere in the gardens a nightingale began to sing. The wedding of the Duke of Ravensworth and Amara Beaumont took place on a golden afternoon in early summer, in the small chapel that stood at the heart of Ravensworth Estate. It was not the grand affair that such an occasion would normally demand, with hundreds of guests and weeks of preparation. Instead, it was intimate, deliberate, witnessed only by those who truly mattered. Martha the seamstress was there, her weathered face bright with tears of joy, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that Amara had insisted on giving her. The Duke of Lancaster and his wife attended, their presence a silent rebuke to any who might question the propriety of the match. Several of the servants who had shown Amara kindness during her years in the stables sat in the back pews, their faces shining with wonder and pride. And at the altar, dressed in a gown of cream silk embroidered with golden thread, her mother's jasmine perfume scenting the air around her, stood Amara. She thought of her father as the vows were spoken, of the stories he had told her about the great kingdoms of Africa, of the dignity and wisdom he had carried with him across oceans and continents. She thought of her mother, who had loved a man from a distant land and had never regretted the choice. She thought of all the ancestors whose blood flowed in her veins, kings and queens and scholars and warriors whose legacy she carried forward into this new life. Edmund spoke his vows in a voice that rang with conviction, promising to love and honor her, to stand beside her through all the trials that lay ahead, to be not her master, but her partner, not her owner, but her equal. And Amara spoke her vows in return, promising to challenge him and support him, to never let him forget the man he had chosen to become, to build with him a life that honored the best of both their heritages. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the assembled guests, and Edmund kissed her, and Amara knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life, not merely freedom, but belonging. The months that followed were not without difficulty. As Edmund had predicted, society was scandalized. Many nobles refused to receive them, and there were whispers and rumors and barely concealed contempt from those who could not accept that a duke had married a woman of African descent. But there were also allies. The Duke of Lancaster remained steadfast in his support, and his example encouraged others to follow. Scholars who had heard of Amara's learning sought her out, eager to discuss philosophy and history and the great questions of existence. Young women from noble families began to write to her, inspired by her story, hungry for the education that had been denied them. And within Ravensworth itself, a new culture began to take root. Edmund implemented reforms that improved the lives of his tenants and servants, establishing schools and hospitals, ensuring that hard work was fairly rewarded regardless of birth. Amara opened the castle library to anyone who wished to learn, and she began to write, setting down the stories her father had told her, the wisdom of her ancestors, the history of a people whose contributions to civilization had been overlooked and forgotten. Together, they created something that had never existed before, a household where dignity was not determined by station, where kindness was valued above cruelty, where love had triumphed over prejudice. It was not perfect. The world beyond their gates remained hostile, and there were days when the weight of that hostility seemed almost too heavy to bear, but they bore it together, drawing strength from each other, from the life they were building, from the hope that the future might be different from the past. 3 years had passed since the wedding, and autumn had come again to Ravensworth. Amara sat in the garden, watching the leaves fall from the great oaks that lined the drive, their colors a riot of gold and crimson against the pale gray sky. In her arms, she held a bundle wrapped in soft wool, and from within that bundle came the soft sounds of a baby breathing. Her daughter, their daughter, born 3 months ago, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark curls, named Eleanor after Edmund's mother, the Duchess who had believed in kindness even when the world offered only cruelty. Edmund emerged from the castle and crossed the garden to join her, his face alight with the same wonder that seemed to seize him every time he looked upon their child. He sat beside her on the stone bench and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the leaves dance on the autumn wind. "I received word from Lancaster today," he said quietly. "The king has agreed to receive us at court. He wishes to meet the woman who has become such a subject of fascination among the nobility." Amara smiled. "And does this frighten you, the thought of presenting your scandalous wife to the monarch?" "Nothing frightens me anymore," he replied. "Not when I have you beside me." She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The baby stirred in her arms, making a soft sound of contentment. "Do you remember the night of the Winter's Eve ball?" she asked. "Every moment of it. You thought you were playing a game. You thought you would humiliate me and entertain yourself, and nothing would ever change. I was a fool. Yes, you were." She looked up at him, and her eyes held all the love and wisdom and hard-won peace that the years had brought. "But fools can learn. That is the great secret that the world tries so hard to hide. Fools can learn, and villains can change, and love can grow in the most unlikely places." He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "You have taught me that. You have taught me everything." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the autumn light fade over the hills of Northumberland, feeling the weight of history and the promise of the future pressing against them from either side. And Amara thought of her father, who had crossed oceans in search of a better life. She thought of her mother, who had loved fearlessly and died too young. She thought of all the struggles and sorrows and small triumphs that had brought her to this moment, sitting in a garden with her husband and her daughter, mistress of a great house, author of books that were beginning to find readers across England and beyond. She had been a stable girl. She had been a servant, a pretender, a pawn in another man's game. But she had refused to be broken. She had refused to let the world tell her what she was worth. And in that refusal, she had found something greater than freedom, greater than love, greater than all the titles and treasures the world could offer. She had found herself. The baby opened her eyes, those gray eyes so like her father's, and looked up at Amara with an expression of perfect trust. "You will know this story one day," Amara whispered. "You will know where you came from and who your people were. You will know that your mother was the daughter of kings, not because of any crown or throne, but because she carried within her a dignity that no one could take away. And you will carry that dignity too, my darling. You will carry it into a world that is changing, that is becoming, little by little, something better than what it was." Edmund's hand found hers and squeezed gently. "We will tell her together," he said. And Amara smiled, and the autumn leaves continued to fall. And somewhere in the castle, the fire in the great hall crackled warmly, and the story that had begun on a winter's night with an act of cruelty ended, as all true stories do, with love. Epilogue: The Portrait. 20 years later. The portrait hung in the great hall of Ravensworth Castle, in the place of honor above the mantelpiece where the firelight could catch it and make it glow. It showed a woman in her middle years, still beautiful, her dark skin luminous against a gown of midnight blue embroidered with silver stars. She sat in a high-backed chair, a book open in her lap, her expression serene and knowing. Behind her, through a window, the hills of Northumberland stretched toward a golden horizon. Visitors to the castle often paused before the portrait, drawn by its quiet power, by the intelligence in the woman's eyes, by the sense that she was looking not at them but through them, seeing something beyond the frame, beyond the moment, beyond the boundaries of ordinary sight. "Who is she?" they would ask. And the guide, a young woman with gray eyes and dark curls, would smile. "That is my mother," she would say. "Amara Blackwood, Duchess of Ravensworth, author, scholar, reformer, the woman who changed everything. And then she would tell them the story. The story of a stable girl who was invited to a ball as a jest and who stole the night. The story of a love that grew from cruelty and blossomed into something beautiful. The story of a woman who refused to be broken, and in doing so, broke the chains that bound an entire world. It was a story that had been told many times now, in many places. It had been written in books and sung in ballads and whispered around firesides from Northumberland to London. It had become a legend, a myth, a beacon of hope for all those who had been told that they were less than, that they could never be more than what the world had decided they were. And at the heart of the story, always, was that single night. That winter's eve when the snow fell softly over Ravensworth Castle, when a woman in a borrowed gown stepped into a ballroom full of enemies and emerged, not as a victim, but as a queen. The fire crackled in the hearth. The portrait glowed in the golden light. And somewhere in the castle, the ghost of Amara Blackwood smiled. Her story had not ended with her death, 10 years past, in her beloved library, surrounded by her books and her family and the legacy she had built. Her story continued, in her daughter and her grandchildren, in the schools she had founded and the reforms she had championed, in every life that had been touched by her courage and transformed by her example. She had been a stable girl. She had become a duchess. But more than that, more than any title or honor the world could bestow, she had become a symbol. A symbol of what was possible when dignity met destiny, when love conquered fear, when a single person dared to stand against the tide of history and declare, "I am more than you have made me. I am more than you will ever know." And that symbol would endure long after the castle crumbled, long after the portrait faded, long after the last person who remembered her face had passed into dust. Because some stories are not meant to end. Some stories are meant to become part of the fabric of the world, woven into the very essence of what it means to be human. Amara's story was one of those, and it would live forever. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know you, so I can know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a tale of courage, love, and transformation. Until the next story, may you carry within you the same fire that Amara carried, the knowledge that you are worthy, that you are capable, that you are the author of your own destiny.